I hope you can all hear me okay. Like any bloke my age, I'm going to have to work from a few notes. I can't remember all of this off the top of my head. But it is a subject very dear to my heart. I'd like to share with you this evening the results of my research into the configuration, colours and markings of two Special Operations Hercules that were used in the Son Tay prison raid, the picture you see up there, which was conducted over North Vietnam in 1970. If the technology and so on sounds a bit old, it is. It's quite like some of us. Those of you who have heard of the raid have probably only heard that it wasn't actually successful. It was a very successfully mounted raid, but there were no prisoners in the Son Tay prisoner of war camp at the time. There was a lot more media speculation about that than there was about anything to do with what an extraordinary aeronautical feat it was. The two Skyhook Hercules that took part in that raid were part of a fleet of 14 specially modified C-130s that came to be known as the Combat Talons, on designation MC-130E. I'll probably overwhelm you with designations and also code words for the programs and projects because it's full of it. But these aircraft, and more than a few of these are similarly involved, but these aircraft were involved with covert infiltration, resupply, and then, to use the American word, exfiltration of agents that were behind enemy lines. I've held a fascination for the Combat Talon since the late 70s when I first started bumping into bits and pieces of information about them. And I was fortunate to see examples in the UK in 1981 and then in Florida in 1982 on the way back from the posting to the UK, and also in 1985 at the Fairford Air Tattoo in the UK as well, and a few others since then. But after a variety of looking for a variety of sources of research information, I was able to write and illustrate an article in APMA magazine. Sorry, that's the Combat Talon in later versions. And there's a drawing from the magazine. I've got a copy here for anyone that wants to read a 41-year-old magazine. We used to exchange magazines with a number of clubs in the States. One of them was at the USAF base at Warner Robins, which is a C-130 logistics center. And I identified these three different configurations, which apparently at the time was quite close to the truth in regards to the secret MC-130s at the time, and that provoked a bit of interest from a couple of the colonels in the club. But they still exchanged information with us. Anyway, so that was my fascination back in 1983, and I had everything I needed to put a model together, but typically for me, I haven't built one yet. Anyway, over the last couple of years, and honestly I can't remember what prompted it, but over the last couple of years, I've researched the subject of the earlier Son Tay raid. The aircraft I saw were all 1980 configuration. They weren't the original production configuration of these special Hercs. And I wanted to draw up a sort of a prequel to the APMA magazine, which their current editor thinks is quite a clever idea, with a little bit of a personal touch to it. And again, I might even make a model, but we won't hold our breath. I've used declassified information, and more recently with a little bit of not quite declassified information, but we'll talk about that, together with input from organisations and even some of the aircrew that flew on the raid, some of whose have memories that don't match with what I've read in the more official accounts, and so it's been a bit of a game to try and work out what the real truth was and what it isn't. But I wanted to get enough information because this was a groundbreaking, very brave, very cleverly planned and very brilliantly flown raid, notwithstanding the end result. But as an aeronautical achievement, it's remarkable, and all of the special aspects of that just go, from my point of view, to make it that much more exciting to think about building a model. I plan to be using the Zvezda kit, and we'll talk a fair bit more about that a bit later on. So look, as I said, this is 1970. I'll take a little bit a couple of sentences to set this in context, because some of you, quite a few of you, weren't born then, and so a lot of it won't make any sense, or at least it won't sound like it makes any sense. So I'll set the scene, talk a bit about the planning and execution of the raid, a bit about the backgrounds, the special mods that were involved in the raid. There's a bit of a link to a covert CIA program, and I noticed Air America over here, which is lovely. Thank you very much, Len. And I should say thank you very much to, I think, both of the Davis boys who put all of the other models on the table except for my grey Dakota. So that's a fantastic display for a special. Well done. Sorry, is there another one? Yeah, sorry, Len got the Air America Commando. Yes, and then we'll talk about my ideas for making a model. So let's set the scene. In a novel thing these days, Vietnam had become the first TV war, as they called it at the time. It was the first war where yesterday's pictures were on today's television screen. Partly because of that, it provoked intense unrest in the US. By 1970, the US had names of over 500 prisoners of war that were being held by the North Vietnamese. Mostly aircrew, mostly Navy and Air Force aircrew. Some of them prisoners of war since 1964. So over 6 years. I mean, that's longer than the US had fought in the Second World War. In fact, the longest ever US prisoner of war was captured in 1963. Sorry. Yes, in 1966 and released in 1973. I think I've got the dates right, but anyway, sorry, 9 years. So whatever it was, 1964 to 1973. Anyway, despite the political differences amongst almost everybody in the US, everyone seemed to agree that something ought to be done about US prisoners of war. In May that year, 1970, a US intelligence organization, using a variety of information from satellites to low-level recce, and even a couple of indications from the prison camp compound, they suggested that there were around 60 US prisoners of war in the Son Tay camp. Let's show you the camp. It's the camp is that bit there in the middle. Notice it's against the river. There's a bridge there and a bridge there, which come into the story later on. In June, the US started a feasibility study to mount a rescue. They identified 2 windows in October and November that year when the weather would be pretty good and the moon would be suitable for a night operation. And in August, the detailed organization planning and training was launched. Excuse me, I've just got to have a beer. Son Tay is barely 37 kilometers outside of Hanoi, out to the northwest. Hanoi at that time was widely regarded as the most heavily defended target in the world, heavily defended against air attack. Of course, the 500 prisoners of war was showing how effective a lot of that was. There was a threat nearby of an estimated 12,000 North Vietnamese troops ready to assist in repelling any attack. Thus, for any chance of success and survival, a very low-level, undetected night insertion was required. The planners came up with the idea of a multi-helicopter insertion of a 56-man Green Beret force for concentration and speed, shock and awe being critical elements. There was the idea of a 14-man crew in a UH-1 helicopter. There we go. 42 more split between 2 HH-53s. They were already flying in combat SAR, combat search and rescue, in Vietnam, and they were air-to-air refuelable. Another HH-53 with guns for local concentrated minigun fire, and 2 empty H-53s to pick up the 60 or so prisoners of war. Close air support was to be provided by A1 Sky Raiders. Again, thank you very much for the Sky Raider here. I have to say it's magnificent support for the presentation. And of course the Sky Raiders were also in Vietnam, and were used to working closely with the helicopters providing air-to-ground support in regards to combat search and rescue. Night navigation to the target would require 2 Combat Talons to lead both the helicopters, which it's believed that this would have been the first night formation flying involving helicopters in Vietnam, and the Sky Raiders. So 1 each for the 2 sets of formations. There's an aerial shot of a practice over Florida. None of them are quite as close as they were going to be. The H3 is quite close. The H-53 is at the back there, the bigger ones. Those 2, they're a lot further away than they would have been. The reason the Combat Talons were chosen was that they'd successfully made undetected clandestine penetrations into North Vietnam at night for 4 years without a single one being shot down. They were fitted with terrain following and terrain avoidance radar, better nav systems than usual. They had radar warning receivers, so they knew if they had been detected, and ECM equipment to help spoil a whole range of the enemy's electronic systems. The crews had the required unique planning skills to get into North Vietnam undetected using the terrain following radar, terrain masking, and more. The Talons were required to fly very slowly, not that far above their stalling speed, to match the helicopter's maximum cruising speed. And so therefore, anyone involved with it will realise that they were flying at a high angle of attack with flaps partly down. The Combat Talons could not make sudden course changes in a formation at night for fear of losing the following formation. So they had formation lights on the upper surface of the wing, and if you look, you can just see them there. There's a little cluster of them. There's 2 rectangular ones and 2 circular ones on each side of that, making 8 in total, and they'll feature as a little bit of colour on the model. The high angle of attack for the C-130s meant that their terrain following radar was in fact almost entirely ineffectual, because you'll appreciate that the radar needs to nod down a bit. If you're flying nose up, it may not go down far enough to actually detect any ground underneath you. So it would detect the higher ground, but not everything that they would have preferred. Just made the job a bit harder for the navigators. And in any case, that particular terrain following system wasn't very good below 160 knots, and that was much faster than they were going to be traveling. There was a clever decision made at the time for the 2 C-130s to use the only 2 examples at the time of a very early generation forward-looking infrared system. This becomes central to the model. It was a Texas Instruments forward-looking infrared designated FL2B. That's the company designation. Many of you will be used to the AN, AAQ type USAF or military designations. It didn't have one of those, it would appear. But the infrared will tell you the difference between land and water, or trees and water, which would at night would have been completely unknown to the crew if they didn't have infrared. And there weren't many, I'll talk about it later on, but there weren't many systems like this in use at the time. But the use of the FLIR was one of the issues that made the navigation to the target successful and the identification of the target, indeed vital really. And the FLIR required an extra navigator, which from a modelling point of view meant an extra position in the flight deck next to the usual navigator, but where the bunk usually is. The distance to the target at night required night air-to-air refueling for the helicopters from HC-130s, a bit like that one over there, or this one over here, but with pods under the wing for refueling. That, again, was the first, night air-to-air refueling. In terms of the actual attack on the compound, the plan was for the UH-1 to land inside the compound with a view to creating as much disturbance and, as I said, shock and awe as possible. The Green Berets estimated that if they were to try and save the prisoners of war, they had about a minute to eliminate all the guards. Hence, the idea of being right inside there. In some ways, being inside was actually more effective from their point of view than trying to break in from outside. The assembled special forces trained repeatedly at Fort Bragg and Hurlbut Field, or Eglin, in fact, which is where that's taken, in Florida, and they were ready by early October. The CIA lovingly built a scale model. You'll love this. It's a scale model. Yes, they built a scale model from a variety of intel and reconnaissance sources, everything from satellites to low-level passes. The model was codenamed Barbara. I thought you'd like that too. It was very realistic and it was used for training. And there is a story that a Green Beret sergeant noticed a bicycle leaning up against the wall during the attack in the compound, which was in exactly the position it was on the model. That's accuracy for you. And attention to detail. I'm so sorry, I'm so excited about this, my throat's getting dry. But you know, you say you've all got to have a passion. This just winds me up, I have to say. I hope I'm getting the point across. The first rehearsal showed that the UH-1 was in fact too cramped for 14 people. I can't imagine fitting 14 people in the Huey, to be honest, but it was too cramped. It was going to be a 3+ hour journey, and with all of the trials and tests that they did, and they rehearsed dozens, if not more than 100 times, I believe, in the States. From the first dress rehearsal, they knew that the Huey was going to be too small. The poor Green Berets couldn't stand up, let alone shoot all the guards in a minute. So they moved to the next biggest thing, which was the H-3, which was also a combat SAR helicopter in Vietnam, but these were just about to be withdrawn from service and being replaced by the Super Jollies that we saw before. And the team didn't know until they actually got into Vietnam whether there was still going to be one of those left, but it proved to be the right size for the team, the 14-man team, almost luxurious compared to a Huey, but the planners knew that the rotor blades were too big to fit in the compound without interacting with the trees, and you'll understand that the trees would win. We'll come back to that a bit later. But they realized it was going to be a controlled crash landing, and to some extent, you know, the louder the crash, the more the shock and awe, and so on. President Nixon gave the final go-ahead on the 18th of November, and bless him, in writing, formally accepted responsibility for anything that went wrong, or even if the raid failed. He believed it was the right thing to try. There were whispers just before from some of the intelligence agencies that perhaps the prisoners had been moved. But anyway, we can talk about that a bit more if you like. I will mention briefly that there were 13 aircraft in the two formations. I said it was about a bit over 3 hours each way. The assault formations was led by one Combat Talon with 6 helicopters behind it, and the other had 5 helicopters. 5 Sky Raiders behind it. I won't go into the call signs, but we can talk about them later if you like. Let me just say that there were the Hercs were cherry, the helicopters were apples and bananas, the Sky Raiders were peaches, and the whole thing was called fruit salad. A total of 116 aircraft were involved in the raid directly or in a support or diversionary or protection role, including nearly 60 US Navy aircraft that mounted a diversionary feint on Haiphong Harbour. Using flares, they weren't actually allowed to bomb Haiphong, but the idea was to distract the radars and the SAMs in the wrong direction. And nearly 30 USAF aircraft, including Phantoms, Wild Weasels, tankers, EC-121 and RC-135s were there for comm support, refueling support, and intel and so on and so forth. It was at the time the largest US night action of the war. Both formations, led each by Herc, took different tracks, but made their way successfully to the target area with the helicopters refueling en route. The diagram on the left shows they left from Thailand. The diagram on the left shows the route of the different forces. The slide on the right shows the more detailed stuff at the compound. The Navy diversionary attack worked as planned, and they got the formations got over the target without having been detected by North Vietnamese radars. The force split up. The Hercs dropped flares over the top of the target. The gunship Super Jolly knocked out two of the guard towers. Banana, which was H3, that one successfully crash landed into the compound, landed rather harder than expected, but engaged the enemy at point blank range. In the meantime, one of the other H-53s had landed at the wrong compound and met some very heavy opposition from surprisingly large and well-equipped and ferocious troops that didn't appear to be North Vietnamese. It's never been, either the US still doesn't know, or they just haven't released who they were, but there was suggestions they might have been from somewhere else in Asia. The Sky Raiders destroyed those two nearby bridges to impede reinforcements. The two Hercs dropped napalm, flares, and what they call battle simulators, which are basically big packs of styrofoam with firecrackers and things in, to make a lot of noise and light up the area away from the prison, but to help distract any of those 12,000 reinforcements that might make their way there. While the two empty H-53s were hanging around waiting to be called in. However, after 10 minutes, they'd found no prisoners. The raid commander ordered extraction of the assault force, and they were all off the ground 27 minutes after they first touched down. During the extraction, the first Hercules flew out towards the Laos border and activated navigation beacons to guide the rest of the formation out of North Vietnam. The second one was the last aircraft out of the area, jamming North Vietnamese ground control intercept frequencies. The Wild Weasels battled SAMs, and the Navy had 20 SAMs fired at them, but without loss. One of the Weasels was hit and was losing fuel too fast for it to get to a tanker, so the crew bailed out, ejected, and one of those empty H-53s stopped and picked them up. So everybody got back safely to their Thai Air Force bases. I'm running a bit over time, so we can talk about casualties very briefly. When the H3 rotor blades hit the tree limbs, repeatedly threw the first Green Beret out of the helicopter side door. The story was that he'd wanted to be the first man on the ground, and his wish was granted. The outcomes of the raid were unexpected in that they didn't rescue any prisoners of war, but the fact that such a raiding force got in undetected spooked the North Vietnamese enough for them to completely change their prisoner of war policy, and they started collecting them together in groups in Hanoi. Now, many of them have been in solitary, and they've been treated abysmally in atrocious conditions. And years later, some of the Son Tay raiders that were just so disappointed that hadn't been anyone there, some of their disappointment was alleviated by the fact that many of the POWs said that was a lifesaver for me. I met other Americans, I could actually talk to someone, and the morale went up, and many of them lived when they might not have done. Of the two Son Tay Talons, the number 2 was lost in a tragic collision at night, night practice interception with an F-102 Delta Dagger in the States. All crew on the Herc were killed, and the guy in the F-102. The other, Cherry 01, which led the helicopters, attended the Fairford Air Tattoo in 1985. And I've got a picture of it. That's me. At the time, I had no idea that aircraft had been, I didn't really know much about the Son Tay raid at all in 1985. But anyway, that's what I looked like as a very young bloke. This has added a nice special personal touch to the research project. That aircraft is now refurbished and on proud display as the sole surviving Son Tay radar at Cannon Air Force Base in New Mexico. But it's no use to we modelers because it's been painted in some disgusting glossy scheme, not even remotely like it. Well, the pattern's right, but the colors and the glossiness, it's just nothing like it was in 1970. Anyway, let's go on to a bit more on the background and a link into a couple more of these aircraft here. The US commenced covert or unconventional warfare operations over North Vietnam from about the late 1960 using the CIA and Air America. Thank you again, Len, for his commando there. And from 1964, the US Air Force. Both initially used the C-123, which is this airplane here, and the right color scheme. For a modeler, isn't that just pant-wetting stuff, isn't it? Look at that colour scheme. The C-123s wore a multicolour colour scheme using 3M's velvet colours, which did a lot of good radar absorption, but they often had no identifying serials or markings, especially the CIA ones. The C-123s proved the value of the type of clandestine mission that both the CIA and Air Force wanted to do, but the range and payload for this old thing were much too limiting. Each of the two services decided that they wanted to replace them with C-130s, but their idea of modifications for the fleets were not entirely the same. The CIA were first cab off the rank. They took two C-130s off the Lockheed production line in September 1964, removed them from the US Air Force inventory. This is a picture of one of them from a Combat Talon website. You'll see the serial number there, 63775. That's the serial number of an aircraft that had crashed in Vietnam and been written off. 640507 was its serial number that disappeared. So the aircraft were sanitized, that is, they removed all identification that they possibly could, not just on the aircraft, but components and so on as well. They used them, CIA used them for deniable covert operations in Southeast Asia under what they called the heavy chain program. They were modified in about 1968 to do high-speed, low-level aerial deliveries. And if you look at the back end, you can see, those of you who know your C-130 say, that's a very thick sloping longeron at the back there, and it is. It's designed to cope with the much heavier air loads when you're airdropping at cruise speeds rather than dropping at the conventional, much slower airdrop speeds. The reason that they wanted to be able to do that is that if enemy radar is picking you up and you're trying to drop equipment to folks that are covertly in someone else's country, if you're on their radar and they see you slow down, they know that you're going to do an airdrop, or they can expect that you're going to do an airdrop. The bad thing about that is you might not only lose the load because they're there to pick it up, but you might lose the team that you were trying to resupply as well. So high-speed, low-level airdrops mean you can drop it and go, and they might pick you up on radar, but they won't necessarily know where you drop the stuff. The aircraft did not have the star forks at the front that are used for covert exfiltration, because presumably the CIA didn't feel they were going to need to do that. Anyway, those two heavy chain aircraft were later demodified and were used as attrition replacements for the Air Force fleet, which I'll talk about now. But there is a link, more of a link between the CIA's heavy chain program and the Son Tay airplanes, and we'll talk a bit about that a bit later on. So for its own use, the USAF contracted through the Big Safari program to modify 14 C-130Es to another special warfare configuration. Now, having used the term Big Safari, does anybody not know what that is? Because I'll show you the book, and then you'll know. This is the book written by the boss of Big Safari. Big Safari basically was a covert, non-competitive tendering process to modify special secret aircraft for the US forces. Anything you see in there, which is nearly all of these, and almost anything else that you can think of from about 1952, when they started fitting cameras behind secret doors in C-97s that were flying the corridor into Berlin. From way back then, anything up to anything with a combat name, a combat scent, all those sorts of reconnaissance and SIGINT things and so on, they've all been modified through Big Safari, which enables the government to use, shall we say, black money and say to Lockheed, all right, we know you can do this, do it overnight and we'll pay you the money. No competitive tendering. Imagine. Anyway, these USAF aircraft did have the recovery forks, the Fulton forks at the front. Just there you can see the balloon that the lucky exfiltrator on the ground inflates and drops up, or they drop the pack, in fact. Release the gas gun thing and up it goes. This thing picks up the line which you can just see coming down through there. The little day-glow tags there are to help the crew hit the thing in the right spot. That's my picture at that air show in Mildenhall in the UK. The flying was just amazing to watch. But they picked it up and there wasn't a person on it. But anyway, it's remarkable to watch. They did dozens, if not hundreds of, I think 86, I think was the number of actual lifts that they did of real people, but there's no record that they actually ever did any in combat. Anyway, the aircraft were, as you can see there, or we can partly see there, they were camouflaged again in that 3M velvet anti-radiation, anti-radar or radar absorbing paint, black and green on top. But the colours are not to, again a modelling thing, these colours are not to FS595. The first 4 aircraft were delivered to Southeast Asia with this rather more spotty looking scheme, which was basically off-white underneath with patches of black. And it was only later on that they camouflaged them completely underneath, or painted them black underneath. The first 4 went to Asia, Southeast Asia in 1966, then 4 to Europe and 4 in the US. And the other 2 out of the 14 were used initially to supplement the CIA's heavy chain program, while the cover story was that they were testing new equipment for the Skyhook fleet, this fleet, with a USAF squadron in the States. So it was in this initial, as you see up here, this initial Skyhook production configuration, and here's another shot of one. It was in this sort of configuration that the aircraft flew on the raid in 1970. I hadn't really realized at the beginning of all of this just how different it was. I mean, I'll show you a diagram later, and many will say, oh, only a bloody mother would notice, but from a modeller's point of view, we look for detail, and the detailed differences are quite noticeable. The point was, I guess, that there'd been quite a few equipment, upgrades in the 70s, and then again in the 1990s. The USAF fleet had that high-speed, low-level aerial delivery system fitted, improved navigation systems, infrared countermeasures pods. Oh, sorry, I should show you one other shot there. That is one of the 2 USAF aircraft, the last 2 that were added into the heavy chain program. But intriguingly, it's in a sort of airliner type scheme, but with the forks on the nose there, which is all a bit weird. Here's a shot of doesn't cover all the aircraft, but here's a shot of one of the aircraft in its early couple of years in Vietnam, and just from there, looking at it, you can see the paint scheme is dead flat, and there's none. Well, we'll talk about some of the details a bit later on from the modelling point of view. The upgrade program, one of the more apparent aspects was as I said, the reinforcement of the rear fuselage, improved navigation systems, infrared countermeasures pods, which you can see there underneath the fuel tank, not especially well, but an infrared jammer, or yeah, I suppose it's a jammer, and an air-to-air refueling receptacle, which you can just see on the top here. Just that little bit of white there, that's part of the part of the alignment marks for the guy flying the boom. So these aircraft could be refueled by a KC-135, provided the two of them could achieve the same speed. And you'll see from this picture again that the aircraft by that stage was all black underneath, and they grew the colloquial name blackbirds, not to be confused with the other blackbird, which is about 5 times as fast. Anyway, the fleet served extensively in Southeast Asia and the Mediterranean and Europe, and it was only with the delivery of 24 new build digital cockpit MC-130H later generation Combat Talon 2s. This is the world's ugliest C-130. Only with the delivery of those in a long staged manufacturing program between 1990 and 2000, that the original MC-130Es became known then as Combat Talon 1s, and they were progressively replaced by these and the V-22 Osprey. And so the last flight of Combat Talon 1 was in 2006. Excuse me. I'll leave that picture there for a minute, but I'll quickly run through an interesting link between the heavy chain aircraft, the CIA aircraft, and the Son Tay MC-130s, which I became aware of just from cross-referencing that book and another one down here called The Black Bats. Does anyone know about the secret Taiwanese squadron that was flying operations for the CIA over communist China? Well, that book tells you all of it. And you can read in there, although it is printed in the States, I just noticed, but there's information in there that apparently is not declassified in the US yet. It appears that everybody knows that, though. Anyway, one of those sanitized heavy chain aircraft was modified and used on a top secret mission into communist China, and the code name Heavy T. It was in the middle of 1969. And I say, the information is still classified in the US, but not in Taiwan, which is where the aircrew came from, and they knew the mission as Magic Dragon. The CIA in the 60s was desperate to find out about communist China's nuclear program. They used that's not a CIA U-2, but they used a CIA U-2 to drop some sensor pods in 1967, but for unknown reasons, they didn't work. And in 69, they got one of those two heavy chain aircraft, appropriately sanitized and painted grey by then, apparently, to be flown by a specially trained aircrew from Taiwan's Black Bot squadron, again, and they call it plausible deniability. I mean, how plausible it is beyond belief, really. Anyway, the aircraft flew out of Thailand, across Burma, deep into northern China's Lok Nor nuclear test range, and dropped, and it's hard to see, I'm sorry, this is the best map I could get. Right down there is the Gulf of Tonkin and a little bit of Vietnam. There's Thailand down there. They flew up there across Burma, right the way up there to northern China and back. Only 13 hours, which I can tell you is a bloody long time to sit on your ass in a C-130. Yes, a few people know, yeah. And the detectors worked apparently very well indeed. They reckon the batteries will last for 6 months, and before the end of that year, when the batteries ran out, the Chinese had let off 2 nuclear bombs, and quite a lot of very useful information was absorbed and transmitted back to satellites or however else they got it. And the sensor packs were able to be dropped at high speed and low level using that reinforced back end of the airplane. The courtesy of the Big Safari program, precise navigation for the Heavy T aircraft was aided by the fitment of a very early developmental infrared sensor made by Texas Instruments, which we've spoken about before. According to that big fat book, the flow was mounted in the nose portion of an underwing tank so as to allow rapid removal and installation of the system. Big Safari also mentioned that the loss of fuel capacity was offset by additional fuel tanks. Oh, I should say, that book doesn't tell you what the Heavy T mission was. It just tells you that it was for that mission. It says for another agency, not the US Air Force. I wonder who that would be. Anyway, The loss of fuel capacity because of the fitment of this forward-looking infrared in the nose of the fuel tank was offset by additional fuel tanks in the hold, which is something that was noticed by the personal records of the Chinese or the Taiwanese aircrew that flew the raid. So one assumes that is fair dinkum, shall we say. And one can only imagine that the loss of fuel space would suggest that the infrared sensor, the processors, and the cooling system, which I gather was quite a bit of an issue for early infrared systems, must have been quite bulky. Not unusual for that early time, as we say, all those years ago. And yes, I said before, the output from the FLIR sensor was displayed in a spot for a second navigator. It was very developmental at the time, and during the training for the Taiwanese crew in the US, it only offered still infrared imagery. Now, I don't know whether I'd like to be thrashing along at 300 knots at 500 feet with an occasional still picture of the terrain ahead. But anyway, they developed it so that it was providing moving imagery a bit later on. And again, for the Big Safari program, through the Big Safari program, the two Son Tay aircraft were fitted with exactly those same two experimental forward-looking infrared systems from the Heavy T aircraft, and in exactly the same manner. However, and this is where the modeler starts to get disappointed, despite extensive research, including the USAF Museum and emails to Son Tay crew members and USAF officers involved in the Big Safari program, I've not been able to find a single photo, drawing, schematic diagram, or even a personal description of what that bloody FLIR looked like, and not even which side it was fitted. The crew on the raid weren't allowed to take photos, and the view is that because parts of all this are still classified, maybe the US just isn't keen on releasing this stuff. So anyway, so we move to how the model would look. This is the only a mother would know a difference picture I was telling you about before. At the bottom here is the Son Tay configuration. These two are in the early 80s. This one, an Asian airplane. This one in Europe with a slightly different ECM fit, upgraded ECM fit on the front, which was later fitted to all of them, but it was fitted to the European ones first because they were at that stage closer to the action in the early 80s. Let's go through the bits. The Fulton system at the front. These little marks, little doodads here, these are little radar warning receivers. There's a little comms jammer thing underneath the bottom and some more radar warning receivers. Chaff dispensers in the back of the undercarriage sponsons. No reinforcement at the back there, and another little radar warning thing under there, and a little one under there as well. And no tanker receptacle on the top there. The radar warning system was the AN/APR 25 and 26. Most of the receiver, those little circular things, which are sort of have a sunken center to them. I can show you some close-up shots later. But this photo shows another one of that period. And just on the top there is something that looks for all the world like a bit of glassware, a glass plate or something stuck on the top. I have really no idea what that is. You can see something similar to that in a couple of other pictures, but it's very hard to pick out whether it's standing up or flush against the top of the fuselage. But one of the more authoritative documents says that was one of the receivers. So a quirky little thing for the modeler to worry about. The underwing fuel tanks, as you see here, are not always fitted, but they were fitted for the raid. Above the center section, as we said before, is those four sets of blue formation lights. My estimation is that they'll look a bit like that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. The square ones there, and the round ones a little bit further out. The other thing that I've mentioned, but of course we don't know about, is the is that forward-looking infrared. I'll talk a little bit more about what I'm going to do about that. We've mentioned the nav station inside the cockpit, the second navigator position. Color photos show this is a training mission in the USA before they went overseas. But it shows that the upper surface scheme is black and green. It's a slightly different pattern to some of the later ones. There's more black on the later ones, there is a head-on shot from below showing a little bit more of what the underside scheme looks like, with strange diagonal patches of black. In terms of national markings, at the time of the raid, the Skyhooks, which was the name given to the Fulton system, the Skyhooks wore a 15-inch diameter, full-color USAF stars and bars on either side of the fuselage, not above or below the wings, and none of the photos of the period that I've got show any sign of a USAF title or a serial number on the fin. So, just a reminder what they didn't have. They didn't have the reinforced back end. They didn't have the deep nose of the later radar. They didn't have the refuelers. And in fact, they only had the flare, only had the chaff dispensers. They had flare dispensers fitting underneath later on. And they didn't have the all-black colour scheme. So for the kit, the model, I plan to use this little beauty. I bought a bunch of those 4 or 5 years ago. I'm not inclined to buy anything Russian now. I'm not saying that lightheartedly. I just don't think I will. But I've got enough to keep me going. The kit says it's a C-130H. It's the latest and most accurate from my point of view in outline and shape. Apart from adding that second nav position inside the cockpit, I don't intend to do any detailing on the inside, but I'm desperately pleased to find that the kit, although it says it's an H, it has actually got optional and accurate parts for a C-130E. And areas like the front of the undercarriage blisters on both sides are shorter and different on the E model than they are on the H model. Thankfully, the kit gives you both sets. And there's an aircon intake on the right-hand side of the nose for an H model, and they give you the alternative little intake for that for an E model as well. If you've got any old photos of RAAF C-130E models, the basic configuration of the airplane is the same in regards to those, the differences between later and earlier versions. Italy, we do market an MC-130E, which is their older kit, but with a very decent set of add-on parts. But they give you this version here, the middle one, with the deeper nose. So you'd have to, they actually give you the lower half of the nose in a separate piece, so you could use the upper piece and the forks, and then build yourself one of those noses. I hadn't said it before, but that nose there, the whole nose installation, was originally built for the C-130 Rescue Hercules, the combat, not combat rescue if you like, but not covert. And there are a couple of sets of aftermarket bits. Many years ago, Falcon did a set. I don't know how easily you can see that. Down this side, you've got 2 halves for each of 2 under-wing refueling pods for an C-130. That's the big dome that houses aerials on top of the fuselage, and there's 2 halves of that nose. That would be a bit. God knows how long I've had that, but that might not fit this kit because it's old enough to have been designed for the Airfix kit, because that was the only one around for a long time. There is an excellent resin nose from Flight Path, and they advertise this as for a C-130E-1, which is the original designation of the Skyhooks, or for an C-130. The little resin nose is a little beauty. The perfect shape and some nice little Nice little tines there for the forks for the front, and a nice little instruction set which doesn't tell you what kit it was designed for, but it was probably designed for the Italeri one. Peter's done a little bit of Peter, the president, has done a little bit of work, and it looks like there might be other aftermarket options from Black Box, which might be available via Red Roo, I think you were saying, Peter. Blackbird, sorry, Blackbird, not Black Box, my apologies, yeah. In terms of scratch building, all of those little sensors and so on along the side, a whole bunch of aerials and other odds and ends, but nothing outside of one's competence, shall we say. But all of those little things will make a difference to how the model looks. But I'm sure at this stage you're echoing my concern. What about that bloody forward-looking infrared? Well, unless any of you can help me out and track down something more definitive, I'm going to build a flat sensor window into the lower part of the nose of a spare C-130 fuel tank. Using examples of the period, I note, for instance, on this B-57G, the first aircraft in the US infantry to guide its own air-dropped laser-guided weapons. In the nose there, it had a low-light television, an infrared, a forward-looking infrared, and a laser designator. But look at the bulk of all the stuff. As anyone else might tell you, there's no room inside the cockpit for any of that. So that gives you an idea of the size of the associated systems and processors that were needed to fit early generation electronics in there. So I'm assuming we're not going to be talking about something too small. The other thing I've got is a still from a movie film on the very earliest prototype C-130 gunship. Like that one there, but earlier than that one. That was mounted on the fuselage side, just ahead of the undercarriage sponson, and that was essentially a sideways looking infrared because the gunship targets sideways, the guns are focusing sideways. It looks a bit like a lantern of some sort. It obviously rotates that way to some extent because of the, well, it looks like it does because of the mount, but that gives you a bit of an idea of the sort of kitchen sink look of some of the early equipment. It's not like those neat little turrets that infrared turrets that we've seen, you know, from a few years after that. So these two examples will guide the reshaping of the fuel tank, and I'm going to mount it on the starboard side, which is the side where the navigator was sitting. And just to finish off on painting, I plan to paint my completed MC-130 in the colours and markings of 640523, my Son Tay Raider, the only surviving Raider, and the aircraft I stood in front of at that air show. I have got all of the photos that I need, but I haven't yet drawn up the 4-view camouflage scheme. If anyone wants to build one, let me know and I can print out a set of drawings for you. I just don't want you to finish it before I finish mine. Photos do show that the colour scheme is most unusual in terms of the haphazard pattern. It's very different from any other of the tech order patterns that you'd see on any other aircraft, both for the upper and under surfaces, but it is mirrored in a range of these special schemes on the Neptune down there and on the C-123 here. There was a lot of experimental work going on for covert and night colour schemes. It just seems strange that when you've got an aircraft that is designed to be secret, you paint an entirely different colour scheme to everything else in the fleet. The colours, as I said, were non-FS595 reference colours, and they were absolutely dead matte and rough finish. One of the participating aircrew described it in an email to me as coarse as a sanding stick that ladies use on their fingernails. And we all use those on our model airplane, so we know what we're talking about. For a long time, the best reference I ever saw for this early Combat Talon was an article in the 1970 edition of the RPMS USA Quarterly magazine, which I've still got down here. Very much a magazine of the times, but hand-drawn and all the rest of it, but a brilliant bit of work. The author is one Tech Sergeant Dave Davenport, who had obtained the true reference codes for the colours, which were, as he identifies them there, that is the 3M part number, if you like. He advised that the undersides were predominantly off-white, which he identified there as a mix of 9 parts white and 1 part black. Again, the 3M colours though. It was that paint that made a big difference to the aircraft being detectable by radar, especially when you might only get a glancing view of it at low level. While Dave mentions in here, in the previous one there, that the areas behind the engines were painted glossy white, there are other photos suggesting that the glossy white was also painted on the underside of the leading edge of the tailplane, which is interesting. All to do with engine exhaust, I expect. But when you've got an aircraft with such a messy combination of colours as that, why would you worry about a bit of exhaust dirt? I don't know really. This is the side views in Dave's drawings. There's his little signature down the bottom, 1969. The question of the colours intrigued me. I spent a long time looking for colour chips of the 3M paints, but with no luck at all. I checked my FS595 cards against my own close-up photographs of the aircraft on the ground in Mildenhall in the UK in 1981, particularly for that upper surface green, which I estimated was close to FS34098, which in itself, you've seen this one before, come along. In itself, if you look at that upper surface green there, there's a Sky Raider with the darker green and the lighter green there. It's not so different to that lighter green. It might be a little bit more greeny. But anyway, that's the only example I've got of checking the colour is those photographs I took of the one over 40 years ago. The photos, some of the photos of the 1981 airplane suggest that the green might have been a bit more olive and a bit darker, but I've got no evidence. And those drawings from Dave Davenport were at the time that the original scheme was there. So I think to do a Son Tay Raider, yeah. And I'll be finishing up in just a moment. Anyway, I'll leave it to you to match your preferred paint manufacturer's products to those suggestions about colours. But my thinking really is that it'll be the dead flat nature of the paint rather than the exact green colour which will make or break the final look of the model. Dave Davenport's scheme will be the basis for my drawings, although the Son Tay Raiders seem to have had slightly fewer and slightly smaller areas of disruptive black, as I said, especially on the top of the wing where the later scheme had more black there and there. And this area was much larger and so on as well. The easy part for the kit is going to be decals. Just the two 15-inch stars and bars from your favourite 72nd scale USAF Vietnam decal sheet. Most of the usual maintenance decals are not visible at all. There's no serial numbers, and even the prop warning stripes are just a faint contrasting line of perhaps yellow or the thinned down green. You can hardly see them. They serve no purpose as a warning stripe. And that's about it. Thank you for your attention. I'll leave you with a poem written by a techo who had worked all his life on RAF C-130s and who understood why people like me just love them. Any questions? Stunned.